Good evening, and welcome, and thank you for braving this wonderful weather out there. My name is Chase Rend. I'm the Executive Director here at the National Building Museum, and I'm delighted to be welcoming all of you for this evening's program. For some of you, this may be your first visit to the Building Museum. Many of you know that the Building Museum was created by an act of Congress in 1980 and housed in perpetuity in this amazing historic building. But we are not a part of the Smithsonian, and sadly, we don't have a direct access to the Treasury building, as a lot of people think we do. We are, in fact, a private nonprofit institution whose mission is to advance the quality of the built environment by educating the public about its impact on people's lives. Through our innovative family, youth, and outreach programs, through our important public programs like tonight, and in our exhibitions, the museum discusses issues related to architecture, engineering, landscape architecture, planning, and design. Chief among those issues is sustainability, and the museum is proud to provide a forum for dialogue on this critical issue. Tonight's program is the first in a new series titled Sustainable Communities. Over the next 9 months, this series will examine a variety of sustainability-themed topics, including our nation's transportation infrastructure, a senior population that is aging in place, how we clean and manage vital watersheds, the creation of healthy communities, and innovative energy-saving technologies. We are very grateful to United Technologies for making this series possible through their generous support, which since 2000 has exceeded over $500,000. Here to say a few words on behalf of UTC is Dave Minky, Vice President, Government and International Affairs. Dave?
Thank you, Chase, and good evening. United Technologies is pleased to sponsor this series and proud to again be working with the National Building Museum, a partnership that began, as Chase said, in 2000 when UTC and Otis Elevator partnered to develop and tour the exhibit entitled Up, Down, Across, Elevators, Escalators, and Moving Sidewalks. Many people don't know United Technologies, so please forgive me a quick overview. We are a Fortune 50 Dow 30 company based in Connecticut, but we have offices in almost every country in the world. While you may not recognize the name United Technologies, you will recognize our companies: Pratt & Whitney Aircraft Engines, Hamilton Sundstrand, Sikorsky Helicopters, Carrier Air Conditioning, Otis Elevators, UTC Fire and Security, and UTC Power. UTC's philosophy about the environment is simple and stated in just 3 words: conservation without deprivation. You can see this in our own operations, where between 1997 and 2007, we reduced energy use by 20% and water use by 49%, while more than doubling our revenues. You'll find the same commitment to conservation in our products, which play an important role in buildings. Otis Elevators today use 75% less energy than comparable equipment from a decade ago. Carrier's SEER 13 cooling products require 20% less space, weigh 30% less, and require 40% less refrigerant than previous models. And UTC's fuel cells are some of the cleanest power generation technologies available today. We've been building fuel cells since the 1960s, when we developed them with NASA to help power manned space flight. Today, they are used in a number of different applications, including on-site power generation and transportation like buses. Unlike the metro buses you had to dodge to get here tonight, the fuel cell-powered buses make no noise, have no odor, at least on the outside, and emit only water. We build efficient products and reduce our own impact, not just because it is good for the environment, but also because it is good for share owners and brings real value to the company. It's about increasing efficiency and eliminating waste. A classic example of doing well by doing good. And there's lots more we can do. The fact that more than 90% of the total energy used in this country is wasted rather than becoming useful work means that the opportunities are enormous. Our sponsorship of this series comes through UTC's Sustainable Cities Grant Program, which supports the development and use of green building practices in urban centers creates new programs to educate the public about the need for more healthful environments, and protects natural resources. Other recent projects funded in this program include applying green building principles to historic preservation at President Lincoln's Cottage and Visitor Center here in Washington, D.C. with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a partnership with the U.S. Green Building Council to develop and support Green Build 365, an interactive green building learning portal, and in New York City, a partnership to build innovative, environmentally friendly homes for low-income families with Habitat for Humanity. We are pleased to partner again with the National Building Museum and look forward to the upcoming lectures. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. The museum looks forward to this lecture series and our continuing partnership with UTC. We are really pleased to start off this innovative series with Jonathan Rose, a longtime friend of this museum. Jonathan's work focuses on integrating transportation, housing, environmental, and open space policies to create healthy, equitable metropolitan regions. With the mission to repair the fabric of communities, he founded Jonathan Rose Companies, a multidisciplinary real estate development, planning, consulting, and investment firm. Since 1989, the company has served as a leading green urban solutions provider. A thought leader in the smart growth, national infrastructure, green building, and affordable housing movements, Mr. Rose is a frequent speaker and writer. His firm's work in sustainably converting an abandoned amusement park into a livable neighborhood in Denver, Colorado, is a remarkable example of his firm's impact on the built environment. Highlands Garden Village, as it is known, is one of the communities featured in the museum's exhibition Green Community for its celebration of a rich past and integration of sustainable design. And I hope you all have seen that exhibition. It's located on the second floor in the corner over there. It's a terrific exhibition. Jonathan's innovative development, planning, and historic preservation work has won awards from a wide range of notable organizations, including the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Global Green, USA, Urban Land Institute, American Planning Association, and the American Institute of Architects. In addition to serving in a variety of roles outside of his company, Jonathan chairs the Metropolitan Transit Authority's Blue Ribbon Sustainability Commission. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Rose.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So first of all, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I know it's a climate challenge night, and that I really appreciate you showing up. And also, I really appreciate being here at the National Building Museum. It's really an amazing resource for the city. And if you haven't seen, how many people here have seen the Green Community Program, the exhibit? Oh, look at what a great audience you are. Well, you're very, very good. Well, if you missed it, it's really, really, it's a wonderful exhibit. And Dave, really thank you for UTC sponsoring this whole series and this exhibit. And the collection of organizations you're sponsoring, such as the National Trust, is a great, and the National Building Museum is a great collection of organizations. The mission of our firm is to repair the fabric of communities. I started the firm 20 years ago, and it came from this. This is a building in the South Bronx, and this photograph was taken not by me, but somebody else in 1980, and that was this same building in 1982, in 1984, and in 1986. And we saw this all across inner city America. We saw that the hearts of our communities were really being hollowed out by a whole series of federal policies, economic policies, social issues, et cetera, which I won't go into. But the question that really arose for me is, how do we repair this fabric of community? How do we rebuild in a way that is environmentally, socially, and economically responsible? And the work I'm going to show you and some of the ideas I'm going to discuss all stem from that question. This is actually, I spent a lot of time, this is some film that I took in that area at that time. And there really, it was an area in extraordinary decline, like at Dresden. This is what was built on that site. And it was New York City partnership housing, single-family townhouses sold, brought home ownership, moderate income people back to the area. And it was a good solution, but it was not good enough. And the reason it was not good enough was because it was not dense enough. So we need some key principles that are going to run throughout my talk. And one is that I do not believe you can have truly green communities unless they are dense and transit served. And we'll get into reasons more why. At the same time, I actually was proposing a transit-oriented development project in Brooklyn at a site called Atlantic Center, at a site where there was an enormous confluence of subway lines and bus lines, and right near the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and it was going to be a mixture of office and retail and housing. And this project was stopped by a group of environmentalists, including NRDC. I serve on NRDC's board now. And so there was an interesting thing that happened in the mid-'80s, which is that the environmental movement thought that rebuilding our cities, having higher density, was a bad thing. And I kept saying, we have a choice. We can either have the tenants who are going to be here go out to suburban sprawl, or we can put them in where they're going to drive and ruin farmland, et cetera. We're going to put them in transit-based locations. And the environmental world at that time said, no growth. They, instead of saying, we're going to grow and let's figure out how to grow responsibly. So there's been a remarkable shift in attitude over those 20 years. Meanwhile, this is a chart of carbon emissions. We all know about climate change, and it goes from the year 1000 to the year 2000. You can see in the front is the amount of carbon emissions from humans in the atmosphere. In the back, it shows the temperature change. They're entirely related. And so there's no question that the impact on our climate is coming from the carbon that we've been emitting. And this has, as you know, many implications, melting of the polar ice caps. This is a projection. So here's current sea level of Manhattan, and here's the blue is what happens if sea level rises 3 meters or 5 meters. And most of our economic activity takes place along our coastlines. Our coastlines are incredibly vulnerable to climate change. And Christopher Toulouse here tonight is doing amazing work in the subject of resilient coasts and how do we build more resilient coasts and resilient communities. But the most important thing we can do is not build in the areas where we shouldn't be building. And we know that climate change has other impacts. So for example, Atlanta, which always had a lot of rain and water, all of a sudden, the climate has changed and there's been less rain and it almost ran out of water a year ago. The climate change has a deep moral implication too, because the people who suffer from it the most are the poorest people in the world. And we're seeing most conflicts that are not being intentionally started by superpowers are wars that are really over precious resources, and these resources are in decline because of because the climate is changing, so there's less water, and then you have tribes or groups fighting over very little resource. And these are refugees in Ethiopia that come from the suffering of climate change. So I'm going to describe a couple of big trends that I think are inexorable and that influence the future of development, or that we have to take into account in development. So one is climate change. The other is peak oil. There are people on many different sides of peak oil, but this is a chart that projects the amount of oil in a variety of countries and oil-producing areas around the world, and then the dotted line says this is what we think global oil production is demand is going to be. And you see demand is going up and supply is going down, and that means two things. It means that despite the current drop in oil price, which I don't really understand, that the price of oil inexorably has to go up, and that the supply has to go down, and the disruption is more likely. And so it's a factor that we need to take into account more and more in our future. Now, there's a public policy response that and so if you look at, these are years 2002 in the bottom to 2020, worldwide fuel economy, and look at European Union, Japan, China, all these parts of the world which have very high miles per gallon requirements relative to America. We're at the bottom line. And so we've been really a miserable performer in terms of public policy with regard to coming up with responses to the future oil shortage, which I think is coming. So another trend is population growth. This chart shows that America is projected to grow by 90 to 100 million people by the year 2050. The deeper the blue on this chart, the more the rate of decline in population. The deeper the red, the higher the rate of increase in population. And you'll notice that the deepest red is in areas often in the southeast, southwest, where there's the least amount of water, where there's the highest, or the coasts of Florida, where there's the highest vulnerability to rising sea level, where there's the most need for air conditioning, and where there's the least mass transit. So these are really the worst places to be growing, but that's where America is currently on the course for growth. And this growth, as you know, is devastating our landscape. We're actually one of the undermining our precious soils, and we do need our farmlands for both their ecosystem services and for feeding us. The other thing that this does, that has another effect on low-income people. This is actually an offering brochure I got. So Phoenix is in the center, and about 60 miles to the left and right are these two low-income housing projects, which somebody was trying to sell me. One in Apacheho Junction and one in Buckeye. And these are about as far as you can be from employment, from schools. So when you put a low-income person in these locations where land was very, very cheap, you condemn people really to a lack of, and their children to a lack of opportunity. Across the bottom is a list of all the many major cities in America. And then the bottom part of this is the percentage of income for a working class person spends on housing, and the top part is the percentage they spend on transportation. And if you look at the very top line, they're all spending between 54 and 61, 63% of their income combined on housing and transportation. But look what a big chunk is spent on transportation, and in many cases they're spending more on transportation than they are on housing. And so what this really tells us, so we have to stop thinking in sectors, in components like housing versus transportation, and realize that they are completely interdependent. And that if you really want to deal with affordability and environmental responsibility, that we have to begin to think of them systemically. So, putting these together, here's the New York metropolitan region, and those areas in yellow are the areas in which in the year 2000, commuters spent between $0 and $600 getting to work a year. And the red is where they spent over $3,800. And there's the same number for 2008. And what you can see is the people who live farthest away from the core of downtown, farther away from mass transit, are spending much more money on commuting. Again, remember from the previous thing I showed, we in the past have tended to put, it was called driving to qualify. We've put a lot of our people who live farther and farther away for affordability, but all of a sudden that's worked against them as a strategy. So another factor is globalization. And globalization, so for many years, America and New York were the financial center of the world. That's no longer the case, and we're competing with Dubai and India and China and London and many other, we've globalized not only financial resources, but financial services. And so cities that are not, and metropolitan regions that are not designed to compete globally, and one of the most important aspects of design to be able to compete is connectivity, are going to be less prosperous in the future. At the same time, we have a dramatic increase in the cost of commodities, which underlies the cost of all our buildings, cost of concrete, cost of copper, etc. So this line shows from 2002 to 2008 how the CPI has been growing, but then the top line, this blue line that's going way off the chart, is the construction inputs index. That's the cost of the things that actually go into the cost of construction. Then meanwhile, amidst all this, we have our financial crisis. And this is a view of the bailout. But the key is that we're in a time of enormous financial dislocation. Interestingly, if you begin to look at settlement pattern, the foreclosure issue, which has been blamed on the Community Reinvestment Act, blamed. The Community Reinvestment Act encouraged banks to invest in inner city communities and downtowns. Actually, the higher the red, the higher the rate of foreclosure. This is the San Francisco Bay Area. So the further you get away from downtown and transits again, you see the more vulnerable the populations are, the more over-financed they were, and the higher the rate of foreclosure. And in fact, if you look at the top 5 MSAs for foreclosure rate, you're seeing like Stockton, California, 1 in 25, and then you look at New York City, and it's essentially 1 in 430 or so. So almost 10 times more foreclosure in sprawl locations than in urban downtown locations. Another trend is, in this globalization, is that we used to trade in hard commodities. So on the left happens to be the first building I redeveloped, an old loft building, and it's called the American Thread Company. Before that was the American Wool Exchange, and they actually had a wool market, and they exchanged as commodity. But now we have trading floors in which the commodities we're trading are not even financial instruments, but they're derivatives of financial instruments, and not only that, they're derivatives of derivatives. So we have created a whole financial system which is not based on the hard stuff of which our lives are made of. That's not entirely true, because at the same time we have built this financial structure on enormous consumerism, and it's becoming a global consumerism. So here we are right near that refugee camp where people can barely afford clean water, and we're selling them Coca-Cola. The peak of this consumerism was probably expressed. This is the incident at Christmas where Walmart's, this is a cell phone picture somebody took as they were opening the door of a Walmart and the crowds trampled somebody to death. We are at a time now, because of the financial crisis, I think, to really think the basis of our economy. And we have a choice, and that is, where we can continue to grow as a consumer culture, or is it time to step back and become an investment culture? A culture that actually invests in its future, invests in infrastructure, invests in education, rather than simply propping up our economy on consumer products. Okay, how does this all tie into buildings and green communities? So interestingly, the built environment, so if you look at carbon dioxide emissions, 25% comes from industry, 32% from transportation, and 43% from buildings. Now, the building number is a little distorted because it's also the energy. When a building uses energy, the energy came from a power plant. But if you reduce the energy use at the building, you therefore reduce the energy production at the power plant. So if you think of the real estate industry as the buildings, and a building can't exist without getting to and from it, or the community industry as the buildings and the transportation getting to and from there, 75% of the carbon problem comes from buildings and transportation, and therefore we're a critical element in the solution. This is two scientists at Princeton came up with something they call the Wedge Theory, and what it really says is there's no way to solve the climate change problem with any one solution. It has to be a combination of solutions. And each wedge, so if you look, the top line is the growth in the gigatons of carbon projected from 2008 through 2050. You can knock off 1.7 gigatons through improving building efficiency, 1.4 through transportation efficiency, renewables, carbon capture and storage, a whole variety of solutions. You need them all to turn down the projection of increased carbon into the atmosphere. So, for example, a typical single-family house uses 115 million BTUs of energy, but it takes 125 million BTUs of energy to get to and from it for the cars and school buses and all that, for a total of 240 million BTUs. So you can green the house, and you can green the car getting to it. You can make it hybrids and cut the energy use by some, but if you take that same house and put it in an urban location, still single-family house, but in an urban part of a city, simply because the kids are more likely to to walk and bike to school or take a school bus, and more trips are shorter, and there's more use of mass transit and walking. You cut the energy use to 143 million BTUs, make it urban and green, and it's a third of the energy use of suburban sprawl. Make it urban, green, and multifamily, and it's a quarter of the use of suburban sprawl. And so to me, one of the most critical things that we need to do in terms of national policy in the next year is really redirect all of our federal programs that influence transportation and housing and climate, and redirect them to the right-hand side of the chart. We need to be making our Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, HUD credit enhancement programs, tax credit programs, etc., all focus on urban, green, and multifamily. And we really need to stop subsidizing suburban sprawl because it's environmentally irresponsible. And this actually shows just another way to look at the same information. It's the gigatons of greenhouse gas per people on the left chart that shows in low density versus high density, and you see the amount that comes to transportation, building, operations, and materials, and the bottom line is that there's much lower gigatonnage per person in a high density development. This, by the way, American suburban sprawl pattern is being exported around the world. So if you look at this highway system in the very center, you see the dragons? This is actually from China. And so what we do here has enormous influence around the world. The solution is, first of all, we need to develop higher density, greener communities that are gathered around mass transit. And this is a map of the transit system of the New York MTA. I happen to chair the MTA's Commission on Climate Change, and on Thursday we're coming back to Washington to release our report, which we spent a year and a half writing on how one greens a transit system. And two things became very clear to us. Number one is that the transit system itself is the key determinant of the greenness of a region. That the more you can get people out of cars and connected by mass transit, you cannot green a region without that. And then secondly, we can green our buses and our subways, and we can use smarter technology, and there's a whole variety of things we can then do to reduce the environmental impact of the system itself. And the system has to become more fine grain, has to have more diversity to it. So there's what's called the last mile problem. So you can have train stations all over the place, but then if they just lead to park and rides, then people are just going to be driving further. So they not only need to lead to transit oriented development, they need to lead to mini buses and car sharing and bike and a bunch of things I'm going to show you. In Switzerland, there's this amazing transit system that literally goes everywhere to the tiniest village. And that's really something that I hope we can aspire to. The good news is that the consumer is with us. And so last year, there's a headline from USA Today last year, and it said drivers cut back for the first time in 26 years, and price of gas was only one of the reasons. And the other reasons were because it was really a better way to live, that people were choosing to, wanted to be in downtowns and in walkable communities on main streets. The problem is that our new transit funding, so we fund transit and light rail systems, et cetera, something called the New Starts program. And the New Starts program has a cost-benefit analysis formula that that encourages park and ride. So here's a BART system in which you get off at the BART in San Francisco and you get out of a big parking lot. And the funding formula for New Start says you get more points if you have park and rides, and you actually get negative points if you encourage walking, biking, or alternative modes. It's a really distorted system, and I look forward to a new administration changing it. Excuse me, this is in Katona, New York. This is where one of our offices is, and this is really what you want. You want, that's a train station on the right, and you want the train to come right into the heart of a mixed-use village. We also need to integrate transit in another way. So here is the Stanford train station, and it's filled with light, and it's got monitors, and it works very, very well. And right next to it here is the Stanford bus station, and it is dark, and you don't know what's going on, and there's garbage out there, and it's really a two-class system. And the bus station is really designed for low-income workers of color, and the train station is designed for white-collar workers in the financial industry. And so they're physically linked, but they're not culturally linked. And so we really need to create this integrated system so that everybody wants to ride both of them and is made to feel comfortable riding both of them. Speaking of riding, there are places in Holland where 40 or 50% of the transportation takes place by bike, even in the winter. This is in New Brunswick, New Jersey. All these people are actually riding their bike to the train to commute to work, and yet the system is not designed to accommodate that. So we need to design our transit system to interface with multi-modes and much more. This is in Paris. In Washington, you now have a new bike share program, right? So you know all about this. So it's a really great system. The other thing is that as we densify our cities, humans actually want to have contact with nature. There's something called biophilia. It's the human desire to be connected to nature. And we're only going to successfully densify our cities if at the same time we make them greener. So this is in the Paris subway. It's actually, we're right on the tracks where they bring nature and light right into the subway system. Another thing we need to do, we need to think more systemically. So this is a Paris subway train car that uses regenerative braking. So when you put on the brakes, like in a hybrid car, it actually is turning a generator. Now in America, we use regenerative braking and it helps run the lights and the air conditioning in a train. But in Paris, the braking actually goes into the system. So as one train is slowing down and braking, it's giving, so trains use their most energy when they start up. So it's the power of the braking of the car slowing down is feeding into the system of the car speeding up, and you can reduce the overall energy use in the system by 30%. By the way, you can get 10 to 20% more throughput through a transit system just by moving from analog systems, control systems, to digital control systems. There's all kinds of things we can do. We need smarter streets. So in America, transit policy for many decades now has come down to a fight over money. 20% goes to mass transit, 80% goes to highway. The two organizations don't really talk. They kind of collaborate on transit bills, but not really. And we need to completely break down that paradigm. So here's a street in Paris with a light rail in the center of it, and a park, by the way, in the center of it. So we need to move to what are called smart streets. And these are streets that have bike lanes built into them, and bus rapid transit lanes, and mass transit down the center of them. And when you begin to think of a smart system, actually a digitally managed smart transit system that's reaching much more diverse communities in a much broader way, it's not about highway money versus transit money, because the reality is the highway guys what they really want to do is they're road builders, concrete manufacturers, and asphalt manufacturers who want work. And there's just as much work for them building this stuff as there is old roads. So it's not about the 80-20 formula. It's about, are we going to build the last infrastructure of the 20th century? Or are we going to build the first infrastructure of the 21st century? And that's really the choice between us. And what we should really be saying is, it's not an 80-20 split. It's 100% of our transit dollars should be spent on building greener communities. Now, communities have within them a value system that's embedded. Everything that we do speaks of something. This happens to be the town square of the city of New Haven. And there were always in New England town squares 4 buildings. First of all, the square was called a commons, which stood for community or the commons. And around it, the 4 buildings were often the church, which represented spirituality, the school, or library, which represented education, the courthouse, which represented justice, and the town hall, which represented governance. And those were the key values of those communities. And so when you went to the town square, you were infused with those values. Modern communities today, what we really find most often in our town centers is retail. And I fully recognize the value of retail. We own retail and build it, but retail in most cases reflects consumerism and materialism. And those are the core values of our communities. It's an important part of our community. It is not a sufficient value upon which you build a culture and a really green community. And so I think we need to think more about the public realm and even the spiritual realm as much as we do the economic realm. Green buildings. So I'm now moving there. I started kind of with some global issues, and then I've moved to kind of regional infrastructure issues, and now I'm working down into green buildings themselves. So this is the greenest building I know, and it's an igloo, and it's not green because it's made out of snow and ice, but it's green because it's a perfect example of integrated design. The snow is just thick enough so that it acts as insulation and captures the heat of the earth, and so that it's a temperature of about 40 degrees inside an igloo, even when it's negative 40 outside. And what that means is Eskimos eat blubber, and it means the blubber is it's a cold enough temperature to refrigerate the blubber, but not so cold that it's frozen so you can eat it. So it's actually a really sophisticated system. The skin of the building is the building's architecture, it's its structure, it's mechanical engineering in effect. And actually, because it's round in the back, there's a whole social, cultural system within it too. So as I'm going to talk to you in a little bit about how we green buildings, we always do what I call the Eskimo Principle, which is to get the skin right. If you get the skin right, everything else follows. McKinsey did this chart, and it looks at the costs of saving, reducing carbon. And everything below the cost, the line is actually not a cost, it's a savings. Everything above the line is a cost. So if you look at the far left, it says building insulation, and then fuel efficiency in commercial vehicles, then lighting systems, air conditioning, and heating, water heating. So in the building industry, the most cost-effective, highest payback, profitable things one can do to deal with the issue of climate change are all in the building realm, except for commercial vehicle fuel efficiency. So we have a tremendous opportunity. And here's another chart that shows options that cost less than $50 a ton, lighting, electronic equipment, HVAC equipment, just another way of looking at another way of looking at the paybacks that come from investing in the greening of buildings. And the greening of buildings create green jobs. And one of the great things about green jobs is they're all here in America, and this is certainly a time in which we need more jobs. And so if we were in this stimulus bill and other programs that we do this year, to really invest. So America has 135 million buildings, and we can reduce the energy cost and use in every one of them by about 30% through some very simple things. Insulation, weather stripping, in some cases new windows, changing boilers, things that will create local jobs that are tremendous opportunities for job training and all have economic paybacks. They all are therefore should be totally financeable and have social paybacks and reduce and improve the environment. They don't solve the environmental issue, but if we could knock 30% off of our energy consumption of our buildings, we wouldn't have to build any more coal-fired power plants. And we could be well on our way towards moving to a much greener economy. So our firm attacks all these issues from 4 points of view. We serve as planners, we serve as owners' representatives, we do development for ourselves, and we started the country's first green real estate investment fund. So on the planning side, we work very big scale and small scale. So for example, we wrote the green building guidelines for the rebuilding of southern Louisiana post-Katrina, and we used a very historical approach. We looked at systems such as sun shading and tall natural windows and ceiling fans. There's a whole lot of local practice that in buildings that were built before there were air conditioning that made a whole lot of sense, that were mold-free, that were for climates like southern Louisiana. And so then we extracted out of those principles for the rebuilding of new buildings. We really, I said, as we densify cities, we really need to bring nature into the city. So this is the South Bronx. This is the Bronx River flowing through the South Bronx. It's a whole corridor. One of the things our firm is doing is working with the South Bronx Greenway to figure out a sustainable plan, an economically sustainable plan for how to make this greenway work throughout the South Bronx. What that means is that area rebuilds. It means that people will have access to nature. And this desire, this biophilic desire, this happens to be in Philadelphia, you see it all over the place, this desire for people to have more contact with nature in all kinds of ways. Another example of planning work we did, this is actually in East Hampton. We do a lot of work in affordable housing. And the community there said, well, there's no place to put affordable housing. We said, take this old gravel pit, which is on the left, and you can put a town square around it. And notice we, by the way, put in a bike lane, and you can put affordable housing above local serving retail. And that, I actually believe, looks better than that. that the after is actually a better condition. The reason why the after being a better condition is that one of the reasons why Americans turned so much against development, why NIMBYism grew, is the fault of developers. That we actually built a lot of junk in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and communities in many cases were right to oppose it. In some cases I don't think they were, but in many cases they were. And the only way communities are going to accept development is if the development is appropriate for that community. So that's our planning work. We also do project management work. And our goal as project managers is to avoid this. So we spend a tremendous amount of time, we focus on helping museums, schools, libraries, performing arts centers, the whole social, cultural, educational, social service centers, infrastructure of cities. We don't think cities can thrive without this social, cultural, educational infrastructure. So we help build charter schools. By the way, help with the financing, the design, the construction, the oversight, university buildings, as I said, libraries, etc. A lot of theaters. We built Rose Hall at Jazz at Lincoln Center. An example of our work, the Windrock Foundation came to us. And now I'm going to begin to show you how we apply some of these principles to specific buildings. And said, this is a building we want to build in Little Rock, Arkansas. Can you make it green? And we said that building typology is simply ungreenable. So we're going to invent a new building for you. So first of all, it rains a lot in Little Rock, so we did a gull-wing roof that collects rain. We do a lot of computer modeling, and we use the computer modeling to do sun shadow studies to design the angle of the roof so that it let in sun in the winter for heating but kept the sun out in the summer. And actually, we energy model every building we design, and we find that has tremendous benefits in really allowing you to do very simple things that have very positive benefits for the buildings. And that was what was built. And it was built for the same budget as that. And we think that's a much better building. By the way, it's using water source, like cooling from this pond that collects the rainwater. And here we are in the inside. So what's happened is, if you look, so first of all, you can see these little white boxes on the floor. There's an underfloor heating and cooling system, so every desk has its own air and can set its own air temperature. It's an open office modular system. But what you see, what's amazing, what you don't see in the ceiling, you don't see ducts because it's an underfloor air system. You don't see sprinklers. You don't see fluorescent lights. You don't see hung ceiling. So we took all the money that in an office building is usually in the ceiling, and we put it in the floor. And we got a much more beautiful space, a much more self-tempering building. It's a LEED Gold building at the same cost. And by the way, there's a lot of systems. So for example, material systems. So for example, it's a foam core prefab roof. It's a metal panel with insulating foam in it. So it just shows up as one thing, more cost effective to install. The only sheetrock in this building is around the bathrooms and the fire stairs. This, by the way, this is an old monastery that we renovated into a retreat center. We really believe that communities need spiritual centers as well, that is an important part of the social, cultural infrastructure. So as I mentioned earlier, much affordable housing has very often been put in the most faraway places. So in trailer parks out in the middle of nowhere, in which, by the way, these trailers are typically very poorly insulated. People are spending a huge amount of money to heat and cool them, and then a lot on their cars to get to and from them. So that's a particularly Western American problem. This is a solution that we built in Aspen, Colorado. It's affordable housing for the workers in this, probably one of the most expensive cities in America. The ski slopes are in the background, so this is right in the very heart of the downtown. The idea of affordable housing, when we proposed this is almost 15 years ago, was opposed. Remember I said earlier, developers are often opposed because they propose things that are inappropriate, and once the design became public, the opposition went away because it's a building that's attractive enough that fits with the design. So how many units per acre do you guys think this is? I hear 40. Got any other numbers? Okay, so this is, 40 is a very good guess. This is 88 units to the acre. And you'd never know it. And the key is So the way we're going to solve the density issue, so density, again, is essential for reducing transportation costs. It's the way we get people off of consuming farmland, is you have to have great design of density. If you have ugly density, then people aren't going to want it. And this is the inside, a south-facing courtyard. And here we are, it's a super insulated skin, large windows on the south side. So we're beginning to see that igloo principle in action. Here's another example. This is affordable housing, low-income housing, tax credit housing in a renovation in Irvington, New York, a suburb just north of New York City, obviously right next to the rail line. We very often put community facilities in the ground floor. This has a public library in the ground floor and then low-income housing above. Another critical thing are federal housing financing systems are really designed to house affordable housing and not to rebuild communities. And so it's very hard often within the structure of affordable housing financing to also finance community facilities. And I think we need to work on the way housing finance is structured to support more of community facilities too. A historic renovation, libraries I mentioned on the ground floor, and that combination of, in fact, again, the community was opposed to the idea of affordable housing. When we proposed affordable housing in the library together, all of a sudden the community reimagined what affordable housing was. They saw it as a local service the way library was, and the community 100% backed the project. So here, we're using as insulation, cellulose blow-in insulation. It's a recycled product. It's recycled chopped up newspapers. It is a very good sound absorber. And remember, we're next to a train station, so that matters. It's a much better acoustic absorber. It's a much better thermal insulator than regular insulation. It doesn't cost any more than regular insulation. It's the recycling of a product, and it is fireproofed with borax. Now, one of the problems in low-income housing is insecticide load. And that pregnant women who live in low-income housing's children tend to have lower birth weight and lower intelligence because of the high amount of the insecticide toxicity in their blood. If you can reduce that, studies have shown intelligence and birth weight goes back to normal. So here we have a material that is doing all these things and is improving the health of the occupants without spending a penny more. And this is really critical. We typically will spend no more than 1% of a building's budget to make it pretty green. It's not about spending more money. It's about spending more thought. It's about integrated design. It's about having simple pieces do multiple jobs. This is a project that is in the exhibit called Highlands Garden Village, and it's an attempt then to put many of these pieces together to build a community. So the first thing is we said it's an urban infill project in Denver, Colorado, and the first thing we said is, all right, we are going to create density, but we're going to do it around gardens. And so there's this whole network of parks and gardens that weave throughout the project. We chopped up it was an old amusement park. We chopped up the old foundations of the buildings, turned it into road base, and reused it. That, by the way, saved us from gravel mining. It saved us from diesel trucks going in and out of the neighborhood, and has saved us $80,000. There's a water shortage in Denver, and I noticed that the sidewalks, which had grass and trees along them, were using a lot of water. So we replaced them with a xeriscape. Xeriscapes are low water using, and cut the water use, and you didn't have to mow it, and you didn't have to use pesticides, and it's pretty ugly. So that's not good enough. So we brought in Denver Botanic Gardens, and they helped us design these, and now these really work. And they're much more attractive and much lower operating costs. As a matter of fact, we have almost no operating costs because we created a garden club, and we really have the local residents do all of the gardening. And we have then expanded the whole way we use this natural system throughout the project. So we have our water detention ponds now are swales that run through the project. This is a supermarket that sells affordable health foods. And literally, when I was sitting here waiting for this program to begin, I got an email that told me that this afternoon it received a LEED Gold rating, which we're very pleased about. And it's day lit. Anyway, there's a whole retail portion to the project. So if you look, those are sunshades. That's on the south side of the building. So to put sunshades up on that building cost $48,000. To put solar sunshades cost $88,000. Those are solar sunshades. So they're both shading the sun and making electric power from it. But we were able to get a 50% credit from the state. So the 50% of 88 is 44. So we were able to get solar-powered sunshades for $44,000 versus just regular sunshades for $48,000. So it's actually 10% cheaper to also be creating green power. I've spoken often about how I believe communities need cultural elements, and so we restored an old theater on the site, and we hold a whole lot of programming. This is in the plaza in front of the theater, where on Friday nights we have outdoor film night. There's actually a picture of a graduation of kids. We built a K-8 charter school. Also, I really believe the communities need spiritual spaces. So we took an old carousel building and put a walking labyrinth into it, and made it the contemplative heart of the community. I'm going to walk you through some other projects. This is in Albuquerque now. So here we are. This is an overview of the region. Santa Fe's in the upper right, and Albuquerque is in the lower left. There's a rail line that just opened connecting the two. And as we zoom into downtown Albuquerque, so there's the rail line, and you'll see the heart of the downtown, just the way I opened the show with a picture of the South Bronx, parking lots, empty areas, the hollowing out of our cities. The rail line stops, the buildings in the upper right is the transit center. And so we're redeveloping this. This project will go into construction in about 3 weeks. It is a low-income housing tax credit, actually mixed-income housing, designed to lead gold standards. And we're using these incredibly innovative windmills to provide part of the power. What's particularly innovative about them is the surface of the windmill is solar. So it's not only generating wind power, it's generating solar electric during the daytime too. And the interior courtyard, another project so all of our work is by transit. So this is and the point of this is to show you there are a variety of conditions around America, and we can do a variety of densities, a variety of building types that all deal with transit. So here we are next to the Stanford, Connecticut train station. Again, an existing empty space, and we're halfway through construction of this, another low-income housing tax credit LEED Gold project. One of the things we really believe is in creating connectivity, and this is an area that was, although literally a block from the train station, disconnected in part by a very narrow sidewalk. So I don't know if you can see that the light poles even go through the middle of the sidewalk. So we're replacing that with this community park, and then a much, much wider street with a double alley of trees that entice people to walk to the train station. And again, we're doing the same thing. So we always try and learn things from projects and reuse them. So we had to do excavation, brought out a bunch of rocks, chopped them up, made them. In this case, actually, we're using the chopped up rocks from the foundation that we took out of the foundations to be our gravel that we're using in building the mat foundation for the project. We're doing a whole cluster of work in Harlem and the South Bronx. So this shows some of the buildings that we're doing in that area of New York City. This is a project that is now complete, but I want to show you another construction type. So earlier I was showing wood frame building. These are block and plank, a very affordable way for building urban buildings. And we applied this in a new way. Here's the building. Concrete plank, actually I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, so remember I said we want to bring a lot of nature back into our project, so green roof, green gardens in the back, contemplative areas. There's actually a youth construction trade academy in the building to train young people to get into construction trades. We actually hired some of those kids and used them in the construction of the building. Those rocks are actually we have a classroom, and then we have outdoor classrooms for the academy. Green roof, sun shading. So here, I'll do it this way. So here, there's the plank. And you can see the plank has these round holes in it. It's used to make it lighter weight. So what we're doing is over all the windows, we have something called a trickle vent. So even in the winter, fresh air is coming in through the trickle vent. It goes to the back of the apartment. And normally in apartments, the stale air is exhausted by kitchen and bath vents. In this case, the kitchen and bath vents go up into the plank, through those holes, and back outside. So we can completely seal the apartments so they're quieter, so cigarette smoke can't get from one to another, so rodents and stuff can't get from one to another. And they each have their own complete fresh air and continuous cycle. And as the warm air is going through the plank, it warms the plank and the plank re-radiates it, so you have a passive heat recycling process all in one. And this is cheaper than building by normal construction because we save the cost of all the ducts going through the building. And we save the cost of the roof fans. And so it's less expensive, it's greener, and it's healthier. Another thing we did in this building is we put the boiler, a gas-fired boiler, on the roof. Boilers are typically in a basement because people used to shovel coal and you want to shovel it down. There's no reason to do that anymore. When you put a boiler on the roof, number one, it runs 3% more efficiently because it doesn't have to heat the fuel gases to go through the flue. Number two, you save the cost of the flue, about $10,000 a floor, 9-story building, $90,000. And number three, it has lower operating costs, and you pick up that extra space, so we can actually give the apartment where the flue is going to be a walk-in closet. Total win-win-win. So that's really what we're trying to do in green design. And that $90,000, by the way, we then, so see these sunshades that are then actually reducing the heat gain in the summer on the apartments. They're sticking outside the building. Actually, I'll go back. You can see them there. They actually add some texture to the facade. Those cost $85,000. So in effect, getting rid of the flue paid for the sun shading. That's the Youth Construction Trades Academy. So I'm just going to show you a couple more projects and then we'll go to some questions. So Via Verde, this is a competition we won in the South Bronx to build a really green building. And you can see the red line. It's a triangular, long north-south site, abandoned. So the first premise, so these are some of the sketches it took as we trying to figure out the design. So the first premise was it's north-south, so we should be taller in the north and shorter in the south so that we can get as much southern sun into the project. And this design began to evolve as we figured out the density and the unit type. And eventually, this isn't exactly the final design, came to this tall tower and then the building kind of cascading down and then turning around in itself, creating protected private interior court spaces. And we then programmed a series of green roofs on these cascading that go from private, so meditation garden in the top, to very, very public action amphitheater at the bottom. And then we did a mix of different building types. So we have low-income housing rental, we have middle-income live-work co-ops, and then we have for-sale townhouses in the low-rise. So one of the things we're trying to do is increase natural ventilation. So we have this building type in the live-work units. So there's a workspace downstairs, and then a stair that goes up, and then this. So this is an apartment. So it's basically a 2-floor apartment. And then the bedrooms upstairs, and you can see how the air can flow through. This also allows us to have a corridor on every other floor, and that means that we're increasing our net to gross ratio. Those are the gardens, and so here we are. This is what the building, which will go into construction in June of this year, is looking like. Here we are in the community garden section. This is looking at it from above, from the highest level garden. And you can see there's a ball field at the end of the project. That's actually not ours, that's an existing ball field. The black panels are solar panels, so we're using the south faces of the building to generate electricity. We're using a rain screen product, so it's an innovative skin. And I think I'm going to end with that and take some questions. So, thank you. So the first hand is over there.
Thank you. First, it was an excellent presentation. Really, two questions back to the transit issue. You touched on the last mile problem, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that. We're going through that here in Washington in the Tysons area, et cetera. Also connected to that, the cultural problem with people using buses versus trains, and elaborate a little bit on that as well and how those two sort of fit together and complicate the situation.
So the last mile issue is that we are doing better as a nation building, and particularly in this area, expanding the metro system, et cetera. But transit is only going to be remember, what this is really about is giving people choice. So I want to make it very clear, I have a car. It's not about getting rid of cars. It's about giving people choice, and particularly older people, being in cars is usually not so good. Teenagers, any of you who are driving your kids around, it'd be a whole lot better if they could get everywhere they needed to know. So it's really about mobility, choice, and affordability. And that means multimodal. And we just need to, we need to be designing our road system, our transportation infrastructure system, to accommodate multiple choices. And then we need to fund things like bus systems. I'll give you, so going back to Aspen, about when we built that project, they were having this terrible problem of it was impossible to find parking in the downtown. So one day they simultaneously introduced two things: paid parking, and the paid parking paid for minibuses that then tour the nearby residential neighborhoods. And when you called a local number, the minibus driver, you didn't get a dispatcher, you got the driver himself. So you could say, he'd be on a route through your neighborhood and he'd say, I'm 5 blocks away, or you could say to him, I'm coming out, I'm a little late, would you wait for me? And you could talk to the driver, you could say, like, I broke my leg, would you mind turning up this street and picking me up? And it works magnificently. So what happened was, the day after they introduced the minibus, people stopped driving to the downtown, creating all these parking spaces that only the tourists were dumb enough to pay for paid parking, and that paid for the locals to have free transit. There's no one perfect solution, but we need to think of integrated solutions like that that are appropriate for every community. And part of it is we have agency issues. So you'll have the bus company separate from the transit company, or the transit company's regional and the bus company's county, or there's a whole lot of institutional barriers. But it begins with thinking of them holistically and then designing for them. So you said the cultural issue. So I showed you the bus station in Stanford. So I have a friend who took that picture for me, who rides the bus all the time. He is white, and he lives in a very nice suburban neighborhood, and he gets out and he walks from his home 3 minutes to a main street, and he gets on a bus to the downtown to get to a train to go to New York City. And he says, not only is he the only white person on the bus, he's the only person from his neighborhood on the bus, and his neighbors laugh at him. And this is bizarre, because it goes right to where he wants to go, when he wants to go, saves him the cost of a car, it has all kinds of benefits. And so we're going to need to think of but when it gets there, it gets to this crappy bus station. And so we're going to need to design bus and other transit systems in ways that are more appealing. Now, I have a slide that I didn't show, but from San Francisco, where Cisco is funding a program called Connected Urban Communities. And there's a new bus they've designed that is very hip. It's got all these monitors. It's got wireless inside it. And it's a place that, frankly, a lot of middle-class white Americans would want to be. It's kind of designed for them. And that kind of bus system will help overcome the bias against buses, probably. Yes?
Hold 1 second.
I don't know if this is quite on target, but it seems there are a number of sort of environmental rethinks that need to be done. Do you have any opinion on things like rail for trails or other things that may have been removing infrastructure that might have a use later?
It's a really good question, because Rail for Trail has been a very successful program. So one of the things we're trying to, so the MTA, we've set a goal that we want to serve 70% of not only existing development, but of all new development in the region with transit. So if you don't have the again, as I said, transit is a choice, but if you're not served by it, you can't even make that choice. And to do that, so there's something called Metcalfe's law. Metcalfe's law is a telecommunications law that says, a theory that says that the more connected a system there is, the more viable, the more robust, healthy the system is. I mean, think of it, if you had a cell phone and another person had a cell phone, you're the only two people in the world with cell phones, it's not as useful as if everybody has a cell phone. And every time another subscriber gets added, the system gets richer. And when the cell phone system can connect to the landline system, it even gets richer. Connectivity makes a big difference. So, typically, so what we need to do is not only have a robust system of train lines, we need to figure out ways to make more and more cross connections. A lot of communities, they only go north-south, and you need east-west. Well, 100 years ago, we had train lines everywhere and light rail everywhere, and there are a lot of these old abandoned systems, and converting them rails to trails is good. It encourages biking and walking, but we could be doing better. If we could get the appropriate width, you could have walking, biking, and light rail, which is, for example, what they're planning in the Atlanta Beltline. And that will allow this interconnectivity that will allow it to make it much easier to get from one place to another. So it's about the enriching. So I deeply believe we need to enrich the interconnectivity of our transportation networks, that the best place to find those connective pathways are old train lines. They're usually in the right places, and we need to reinvigorate them. Yes?
I agree with your argument that we have to invest in urban density and public transit. The thing that I hear over and over again from friends who live out in the suburbs is that, well, inner city schools are bad. Mm-hmm. So hand in hand with the investment in infrastructure, I think we need to also see an investment in education and education reform and beefing up inner city schools so that people move back into the cities.
So I totally agree, and you mentioned, at least 4 or 5 times I said our cities need a social, cultural, educational infrastructure. But in part, we also need to overcome some myths. So that inner city schools were bad, but there are the charter school movement, the magnet school movement. There are a lot of great urban schools in America today. They're not all perfect. They're competitive. You can't always get into them. But we are beginning to make strides in that area, and we need to continue. And one of the things I believe is we need to be, we live in a departmentalized world. So there's Department of Education, there's Department of Housing, HUD, et cetera. We need integrated funding schemes so that when you're rebuilding a community, you can be building mixed income housing and building better schools at the same time. Yes?
Hold on one second. Let me bring a microphone, please. Thank you. What is your working definition of being effectively served by transit?
To have enough transit when you want it, that'll take you where you want to go. By the way, somebody was telling me recently that, so when I leave here, I'm going to take the Excel and go back to New York, and which now runs every hour. And I was talking to Bob Yarrow from the Regional Plan Association. He said, with these few improvements, et cetera, we could get it to run every half hour. And then he said, and with these few improvements more, I think within 10 years, we can have it running every 15 minutes. And getting from New York to Washington in an hour and like 48 minutes or something like that. It's like astounding. I mean, I think if you had trains running, the high-speed trains running between, and he said, by the way, it'd be New York to Philadelphia, it'd be 35 minutes. If you had an under 2-hour trip running every 15 minutes, that's more than I think I need, but I think we completely change the paradigm of how those two cities interconnect. Yes?
You've mentioned that you build high-density, affordable housing. How do you deal with the parking? Do you unbundle it? Do you charge more for it? What if the zoning requires you to provide more than you think you really need?
So the question is, how do we deal with parking? And fortunately, we tend to build in places where the zoning does not require us to build more than we need. So, I have I have many views about parking. One is that, so in a really transit-rich city like New York, we build as little as possible, and some is required. Actually, we try and get around zoning variance. We try and get variances to build almost none in New York. It's not needed. The other thing is there's a real quandary for low-income people, and that is they can't afford to pay for parking. On the other hand, in many communities, there is not enough transit and parking, and a car is absolutely necessary for access to jobs. And there is a growing environmental movement that says, take out the parking in affordable housing, and I'm the only voice that I know of that's against that, because I really believe that low-income people need mobility, and they need every chance to get to education, job training, their kids, and sometimes that means a car, and that having a car is an essential part of American mobility, economic mobility too. And so we really try and provide for, particularly in low-income housing, to make sure there's enough parking for there's not too much, but there's enough. Now the problem is paying for it, and that's tough because most affordable housing programs barely have enough money to pay for the housing, much less the parking that goes with it. And so, for example, in the Albuquerque project I showed you, we're very fortunate to get a separate grant from the city to pay for a parking garage that will be adjacent to the affordable housing. Even though the housing's right next to transit and walking to the downtown, I want to make sure those people have another way to get to work if they need it.
Let's take a few more questions.
Okay, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Yep.
Who was it? Thank you.
Jonathan, how dependent is your vision of development on public funding? The converse question is this market viable? In other words, are we going to be able to develop this way without a whole lot of government infusion?
Okay, so my vision of development is completely dependent upon public funding. There is only one way to build affordable housing in America. The cost of construction and the incomes is too high, the incomes are too low. One can only build with public funding, and so our goal is not only to be very good at putting together public funding, but we think these are strategies that use it most responsibly by improving the environment, by getting more value out of infrastructure. Not everything we do uses, so I'm going to show you an example of something else though. So we also created the country's first green real estate investment fund. And we are buying existing buildings and greening them and owning them. And that has it can have some projects have public funding, but that works entirely without public funding. So this is a building that we bought in downtown Seattle. It's in the very heart of the downtown. That's lower right chart is something called the Walker's Score, and it's in Walker's Paradise. There's a website we can go and it shows how connected it is. So 1920s building was really a historic renovation that we did. We did a lot of, one of the things we do, by the way, is we do tenant surveys to see how, in this building, you can see how many people are going by bike and walking, carpool. Only 16% are driving to get to the building. Energy modeling to come up with a strategy. There was, I don't have much, unfortunately I don't have the interior pictures in this, but essentially we took a building that was 68% occupied, and by greening it and then leasing it to green tenants, it's now 98% occupied. We took the rents from $16 a square foot and raised them to $24 a square foot. And in the same time, we built a community. So it's filled with all these tenants that are doing these great green things. They now hold a party almost once a month. That's the open house of Green Party for downtown Seattle. And so in this economic climate where occupancy vacancies are going up, ours are not. So we think actually if you combine community building and greening on the market rate side, it also has tremendous benefits. Yes?
Hi. So I realize they're your competition, but when you talk to fellow developers or builders, do you appeal to their profit motives, to their ethos, to their environmental consciousness to convince them to go outside and do something differently than what zoning already allows them to do? Because all the stuff, clearly, you've gone through the hard work of making these things happen when the zoning didn't permit it by right. What do you find the most persuasive arguments to your counterparts to get this kind of development done?
Well, first of all, a lot of this does exist by right as zoning. We actually have a practice, although we do change zoning, We don't change zoning against the community's wish. Life is too short to get into fights. I mean, there's no fights anyway. So we try and really do something we think is consonant with the vision of a community. The development community is changing extraordinarily quickly. And I co-chair the Committee on Climate Change, Land Use, and Energy for the Urban Land Institute. And through the Urban Land Institute, I've seen the developers' interest in greening and mixed income dramatically grow in urban infill. Partly that's where the market is. Partly, my uncle defines a developer as somebody who risks everything he has for something he doesn't need. So developers are developing not just to make more money. Most of them, after a few projects, have enough. They're developing because they actually want to create something. Now, many of us may think you may have many views about what they're trying to create, but many developers actually have a pride in what they're doing. And as these ideas become more accessible to them, there's a hunger to achieve those. I'm also seeing in older developers a desire to leave a legacy, or older developers whose grandchildren are saying to them, why can't you do something good for the earth? So we're seeing a wide variety of motivations. The economics are part of it, but they're not all of it. And the truth is, economics are purely a mental construct. There is nothing such as inherent value. There is no reason why oil was $140 a barrel one day and 4 months later is $40 a barrel. It is purely a mental projection about what markets truly are. And so developers, everybody uses economics to justify why they do things. But the reality is we are not pure economic beings. We move from value systems. Sometimes it's greed, sometimes it's fear, and sometimes it's altruism. And what we're seeing is that the shift towards the altruistic side, people need permission, unfortunately, in the society to be more altruistic or to have a more inclusive view. And one of my great hopes of the Obama administration is that we will set a new value tone in America in which we'll still, by the way, I have to pay all my mortgages, I have to pay my taxes, I have the projects all have to perform economically or they're not going to get built and they're not going to get financed. But there is a difference in an underlying value system, and I am finding the development community more and more aspires to that too.
So I'm sure there are other questions, but we've run out of time for this evening. For those of you who didn't get a chance to ask your question, we're happy to say that tonight we've been videotaping the program, and it will be posted on our website by next Tuesday, we're hoping. At that time, you're welcome to visit the website and then submit a question to Mr. Rose, who has agreed to answer a number of them over the course of the next month. So let's thank Jonathan Rose for being here tonight, and thank you all for coming.